My father-in-law stood up from the head of the dining table, pointed toward the front door, and told me to take my son and get out of his house. It was Easter Sunday. My boy was 3 years old and still had a smear of chocolate on his cheek from the egg hunt we had done in the backyard only an hour before. I didn't argue. I didn't cry right there at the table, even though I wanted to. I picked him up, pressed him against my shoulder, so he couldn't see the expressions on the faces of the people sitting around that room, and I walked toward the door. What I didn't know, what none of us knew, was that my son had slipped something underneath his plate before we sat down for dinner. A folded piece of paper he had been carrying in his coat pocket all morning. He had made it at daycare 2 days before and asked me to help him write one sentence on the back. Less than 20 minutes after we left, someone found it, and the man who had just thrown us out of his home sat down on the kitchen's floor and wept. My name is Deanna. I'm 32 years old. 10 months before that Easter, my husband Jonah was killed in a car accident on the 17 outside Ottawa on a Tuesday morning in June. He was 34. He was on his way to a site meeting. He never made it. Losing Jonah collapsed everything I had built my life around. But I still had my son, and my son had his father's mouth, his father's laugh, and the exact same way of tilting his head sideways when he was trying to figure something out. Some days that was the only thing that got me out of bed. In the months after the accident, I tried very hard to keep my boy connected to Jonah's family. His father Reginald lived in Canada, just west of the city, in the house where Jonah grew up. Jonah's younger sister had moved to Vancouver but came back for holidays. There were aunts, cousins, family friends who had known Jonah since he was my son's age. I wanted my boy to grow up knowing those people. I wanted him to hear stories about his dad from people who remembered him differently than I did. As a kid who collected hockey cards and burned every grilled cheese he ever attempted. That was the version of Jonah I couldn't give him on my own. But my father-in-law made it hard from the beginning. He was a retired civil engineer who had spent 40 years being the most certain person in any room. He had an opinion about everything and the confidence to deliver it, without asking whether you wanted to hear it. After Jonah died, that certainty curdled into something else. He became cold, cutting. The kind of man who could make you feel like a trespasser inside a room you had every right to be in. The first time I brought my son to visit after the funeral, my father-in-law barely looked at me. He kissed my boy on the top of the head, then turned his back and walked to the kitchen. When I asked if I could help with anything, he told me he had managed fine before I came along and expected to keep doing so. I told myself he was grieving. I told myself I would keep showing up anyway. I brought food. I brought my son. I sat through dinners where my father-in-law talked about Jonah's accomplishments, as though I hadn't been there for half of them. He would reference Jonah's first engineering job, Jonah's team at work, Jonah's plans to renovate the basement, never acknowledging that most of those things had happened while Jonah and I were already together. As though I were a footnote instead of a partner. I kept coming back. I told myself it was for my boy. Easter was my idea. I called my father-in-law in March and suggested we spend it together. He said fine, that Jonah's aunt and a couple of cousins would be there too. I spent the Thursday before making a pasta salad and a lemon loaf because I knew he didn't bake. I let my son pick out a potted tulip from the greenhouse near our apartment, because he wanted to bring something to show Grandpa. The morning we left I was almost cheerful. The tulip was yellow. The sky was that specific pale blue that shows up in Ottawa in April when you've survived another winter. And you're starting to believe in warmth again. My son fell asleep in his car seat on the drive over, his chin tipped down, his hands curled in his lap. I reached into the back seat at a red light and fixed the collar of his little navy sweater. I thought, we are going to be okay. That thought evaporated about 15 minutes after we arrived. My father-in-law met us at the door and took the tulip from my son with 2 fingers, like he was accepting a piece of paper he hadn't asked for. He set it on the front step without a word. My son watched it happen and then looked up at me. It's okay, buddy. Come on, let's go inside. The afternoon started with small things, the kind you're supposed to ignore. My father-in-law asked if I had remembered to bring serving spoons for the pasta, because last time there was nothing to use. There had been spoons last time. I had left them behind by mistake. He had been holding that for 3 months. Later, while I was helping my son wash his hands in the bathroom, I heard my father-in-law telling one of his cousins that Jonah had been very independent and had always handled everything himself. The implication wasn't subtle. He was telling the story of his son's life in a way that quietly removed me from it. Jonah's aunt tried to redirect the conversation a few times. She asked my son about daycare, asked me how my nursing shifts had been, told a story about Jonah as a teenager that actually had everyone laughing. But every time things lightened, my father-in-law pulled them back. He commented that my son looked thin and asked whether I was feeding him properly. He said it the way you'd say it about a dog you weren't sure was being cared for. I looked at my boy, who was cheerfully eating his second dinner roll, and I said nothing. Just before we sat down for dinner, my son dug around in his coat pocket and took out the folded piece of paper he had been guarding all morning. He climbed up onto his chair at the table and slid it quietly under his plate, patting it once like he was putting it to bed. "What's that, buddy?" I asked. "It's a surprise for after dinner," he said seriously. "Miss Tran said surprises are better at the end." I smiled and let it go. Dinner was uncomfortable from the first minute. The conversation was careful the way it gets, when everyone in a room knows something is wrong. But nobody wants to be the one to name it. My son ate his potatoes and kicked his feet under the table, and asked twice if there was dessert. And I was genuinely grateful for him, because his presence made it impossible for things to get too cold. Then Jonah's cousin said something that shifted the temperature of the room entirely. He was talking about my son, smiling across the table at him, and he said that the boy had Jonah's stubbornness, that he wouldn't give up on anything once he had decided. Several people laughed and nodded. I felt my chest tighten with something that was half grief and half love. I thought my father-in-law might soften at that. I thought hearing his son and his grandson might reach him. Instead, he set down his fork. He looked at me, not at my son. "You bring that child here every few weeks," he said, his voice very quiet, "as if that earns you something." The table went still. "Reginald," his sister began. "I'm not finished," he said. "Jonah is gone. You are not his family, you were his wife, and now that chapter is closed, and I have been patient about this for 10 months. He paused, "but I am done pretending this arrangement makes sense." I looked at him. "What arrangement?" "You showing up here," he said. "Using my son's child to keep a foot in a door that should be closed." The words landed like something physical. I heard someone at the far end of the table shift in their chair. I heard my son say quietly, "Mommy?" I put my hand on his back. "You are a guest in my house," my father-in-law continued, his voice rising now, "and I am asking you to take your son and leave, now." The room did not move. Not one person said a word. His cousin stared at the tablecloth. His aunt looked toward the window. His sister pressed her lips together and stayed silent. And that silence, that careful, practiced, cowardly silence, hurt almost more than the words. I looked around the table once. I wanted someone to speak. Nobody did. I stood up slowly. I picked up my son and held him against my hip. He was confused but quiet, watching the adults the way small children do when they sense something they're not being told. "Thank you for dinner," I said. My voice was steady. I don't know how. I carried my son to the front hallway, got him into his shoes and his jacket, picked up my own coat from the hook by the door. I didn't rush. I didn't slam anything. I opened the front door, stepped out into the April evening, and walked to the car. I didn't let myself cry until I had him buckled into his seat and the doors were closed. The drive home took 40 minutes. My son fell asleep within the first 10, his head tipped against the window, his sneakers still a little muddy from the egg hunt. I drove with the radio off. The highway was quiet. The sun was going down behind the tree line to the west, and everything outside the windshield looked completely ordinary. Like nothing had happened. I kept both hands on the wheel. At some point I passed through Stittsville, and a Tim Hortons sign lit up the corner, and I thought about stopping, and then I didn't, and then I just kept driving. Somewhere around Bell's Corners, I started to breathe normally again. And then it hit me, the drawing. My son's surprise, still under his plate at Reginald's table. I felt it like a drop in my stomach. He had spent 2 afternoons at daycare making it. I had helped him fold it. He had carried it in his coat pocket all day Saturday and all Sunday morning, telling me he had a surprise for Grandpa but refusing to tell me what it was. I thought about turning around. For a few seconds I genuinely considered it, parking the car, walking back to the front door, going in just long enough to retrieve a piece of paper from under a plate. Then I thought about what I would have to walk back into. The faces at that table, the silence. My father-in-law, still sitting at the head of it. No. That drawing had been made with more kindness than he had shown us all afternoon. If he found it, he found it. If he threw it away, then that told me everything I still needed to know about what we were dealing with. I kept driving. Back at the house, the dinner table had gone very quiet. No one had touched dessert. The conversation that had been carefully suppressed all evening now felt impossible to start. People moved plates without eating anything more. The comfortable numbness that had kept the room polite for months was no longer working. It was Jonah's aunt who noticed it first. She stood up to carry some dishes to the kitchen and paused on her way back, looking at my son's empty chair. Something small and white was sticking out from beneath his dinner plate. She reached over and picked it up. A piece of paper folded into quarters, slightly soft at the edges from being carried in a coat pocket. She turned it over and read the crayon letters on the outside. For Grandpa, uppercase slightly uneven, the way a daycare teacher helps a 3-year-old spell something he wants to say. She carried it across the room and held it out to Reginald without speaking. He looked at it for a moment without taking it. Then he reached out and unfolded it. The drawing was in crayon. 3 figures stood in a row, a small one in the middle, a taller one on the left with yellow scribbled hair, and an older one on the right with a big square head and what appeared to be a gray sweater. Below the figures, in the same careful letters as the outside, were 3 words, Mommy Grandpa. The 3 of them standing together, a family. Jonah's cousin was sitting nearby. She saw his face change and leaned slightly closer, trying to make out what he was looking at. Is there something on the back? She asked softly. He turned it over. On the back, in handwriting that was clearly an adult's, careful printed small, was a single line, Grandpa, I drawed us, I love you. From your grandson. The dining room went completely quiet. Not the tight, uncomfortable quiet from before. Something different. Something that pressed down on every person in that room and made them hold very still. My father-in-law stared at the line of text for what felt like a long time. My son had drawn them as a family, all 3 of them, standing in a row. And that was when it reached him, not as an argument, not as an accusation, not as anything I had said or could have said, but as the simple, uncomplicated truth from a 3-year-old who had no reason to be anything but honest. His son was gone, but his son had left behind a child who drew pictures of his grandfather and carried them in his coat pocket to Easter dinner. A child who called him Grandpa and meant it without conditions. And my father-in-law had sent that child home. His hands began to tremble around the edges of the paper. A sound came out of him that didn't sound like him at all, low and broken, the kind of sound that happens when something that has been held back for a very long time finally gives way. He pressed the drawing against his chest, bent forward in his chair, and wept. Nobody at that table had seen Reginald cry since Jonah's funeral. A few people had privately wondered whether he was capable of it anymore. His sister got up from her chair and stood beside him with her hand on his shoulder. She didn't say anything, she just stood there. After a long time, Jonah's cousin spoke. His voice was careful, the way you speak when you're about to say something that can't be unsaid. Jonah called me the week before the accident, he said. We were talking about the summer. He said the thing he was most looking forward to was bringing the baby to a Senators game. He kept saying, the 3 of us, it has to be the 3 of us. He talked about Deanna all the time, like she was just part of the sentence, like you'd say your own name. She was just part of how he described his life. He looked around the table slowly. He would not recognize what we've been doing here. Jonah's aunt had been quiet since returning to her seat. Now she set down her glass. I should have said something a long time ago, she said. Every visit, every phone call, I could see what was happening. I watched her walk in here and try. I saw the things that were said to her, her voice caught, and I told myself it wasn't my place to interfere. That if I said something it would only make it worse. She shook her head. But that was about keeping my own peace. It wasn't about her. His cousin lowered her head. I thought the same thing, she said quietly. Every time I saw it happening, I found something else to look at. One by one, each person in that room said a version of the same thing. That they had watched. That they had known. That they had chosen the path that required the least from them. Each admission sat on top of the others, building into something heavy and shared. They hadn't wounded me with harsh words. They had hurt me by offering none at all. My father-in-law listened to all of it. He did not argue or explain himself. He held my son's drawing in his hands and he listened. When the last person had finished speaking, He looked down at the three crayon figures again, the small one in the middle, the yellow hair on the left, the gray sweater on the right. He understood, finally, what he had been doing. Grief had told him a story, that if he let me stay part of his life, he was agreeing to a version of things where Jonah was simply gone, and that was that. That keeping me at a distance was a way of refusing to accept the loss. But the story had been wrong from the beginning. I wasn't the reason Jonah was gone. I was one of the reasons his son had been happy. And this child who drew pictures and carried them in his pocket to give to people he loved. He was the most alive part of Jonah that still existed in the world. My father-in-law had spent 10 months treating that fact like a problem to manage. "I'm sorry," he said, barely audible, to no one in particular and to everyone. The Easter decorations on the mantel, the small ceramic eggs and the paper chain my son had noticed and pointed at when they first walked in, all of it still sat exactly where it had been placed before dinner, bright and cheerful and completely at odds with the wreckage of the evening. I was in the kitchen giving my son a bath when my phone rang. I almost didn't answer. I was tired in a way that went past physical, the kind of tired where your body is functioning but some deeper part of you has simply decided to take the night off. It was Jonah's aunt. She told me what had happened. The drawing, Reginald, the things that were said at the table after I left. I listened without speaking. When she finished, she asked if I was all right. "I think so," I said. "But eventually." She told me she was sorry she had stayed quiet for so long. I said I understood. I meant it, mostly. After I hung up, I sat on the edge of the tub while my son played with a rubber dinosaur and narrated a complicated story about it finding treasure at the bottom of the ocean. I watched him. His hands moved fast and his mouth moved faster, and he was completely, utterly fine. Kids have this gift that adults lose somewhere along the way, the ability to be fully inside whatever moment they're in. My son was in the bathtub with his dinosaur. The evening was already behind him. I thought about what I wanted for him. Not just now, but years from now. I wanted him to know his father's family. I wanted him to have a grandfather who showed up for him, who held some version of Jonah that I couldn't carry alone. But I also knew I could not purchase that for him. I could not keep showing up somewhere I was treated as a problem, until someone finally decided to be better. Whatever came next would have to be different. Or it wouldn't come at all. 3 days after Easter, I heard a knock at the apartment door in the early afternoon. My son was napping. I looked through the peephole and saw my father-in-law standing in the hallway, with his coat still on, holding a paper bag from the bakery on March Road that Jonah had loved. I opened the door. He looked like he hadn't slept well. The certainty that usually occupied every room he walked into had gone very quiet. He held out the bag. "Your son liked the butter tarts last time," he said. I thought he stopped, started again. "I brought them for him. But I came to talk to you." I stepped back from the doorway. He sat at my kitchen table. I made tea. For a little while neither of us spoke, and that silence was different from every silence that had come before it, not hostile. Not careful, just two people sitting with something difficult. Then he said, "What I did on Sunday was wrong. I know that. I've known it for a long time, honestly, and I kept choosing to do it anyway." He wrapped both hands around his mug. "That's the part I'm having trouble living with. It wasn't a moment of bad judgment. It was a pattern. And I let it keep going." I looked at him. "Why?" He was quiet for a long time. "Because every time I looked at you," he finally said, "I saw all the time Jonah doesn't have anymore. And I wanted someone to be responsible for that." He met my eyes. "You weren't. I knew you weren't. But you were there, and he wasn't, and I am not proud of what I did with that." I took a breath. "I appreciate you saying that," I said, genuinely. "But an apology and trust aren't the same thing. They're not even close to the same thing." He nodded. He didn't rush to fill the space. "If you want to be in my son's life," I continued, "it starts now, not from some version of before. Now. And it has to be consistent. He's 3. He doesn't understand why some visits feel safe and some don't. I do, and I'm the one who has to explain it to him." I kept my voice even. "There won't be comments about how I raise him. There won't be comparisons or implications, or dinners where I sit and absorb whatever needs to come out that day. The moment any of that starts again, we step back. No debate." He said, "I understand." "I mean it," I said. "I know you do," he said quietly. "Jonah always said you meant what you said." That almost broke me. I held it together. "Short visits for now," I said. "We build slowly. If it works, it keeps going. If it doesn't, we stop." He agreed without conditions. When my son woke up from his nap and walked out in his socks to find his grandfather sitting at the kitchen table, his face opened up into that full-body kind of happiness that small children haven't learned to be self-conscious about yet. He climbed straight into the old man's lap and started explaining, very seriously, something about a dream he'd had, involving a bus and several penguins. My father-in-law listened to the entire story. He asked follow-up questions. He said, "Is that right?" Twice in a voice I had never heard him use before. I sat across the table and drank my tea. The months that followed were not simple. There were visits that felt genuinely good, and a few that felt careful and stretched. My father-in-law made mistakes. Not cruel ones, just the ordinary mistakes of someone learning a new way to be in a relationship. He caught himself sometimes. Other times I caught him. We talked about it more directly than we ever had before, which was uncomfortable, and also, slowly necessary. What changed most was the smallest thing. He started asking how I was, not in the cursory way you ask it passing someone in a hallway. He would sit down and ask, and wait for an actual answer. I started giving him one. My son's drawing ended up framed. Reginald did it himself, went to a framing shop near his house in Canada and had it mounted on a cream background with a simple maple wood frame. The next time I brought my son for a visit, it was hanging on the wall in the front hallway, right beside a photograph of Jonah from university. 3 crayon figures, Mommy Grandpa. My son stopped in front of it, on his way through the door, and stared at it for a long moment with the particular solemnity of a child encountering something surprising. "Grandpa, that's mine," he said. "I know," his grandfather said. "That's why I put it there." Looking back, I know that Easter Sunday was the worst evening I had spent since the week Jonah died. But I also know it was the evening that finally broke something open that needed to break. Not because my father-in-law cried, and not because the family finally admitted what they had been allowing to happen. Those things mattered, but they were just the beginning. What changed me was what happened in the car on the way home. The moment I made the decision to keep driving instead of turning around. The moment I understood that protecting my son didn't mean fighting for every table where we were unwelcome. It meant choosing, deliberately, the ones where we were wanted, and building from there. Some people need to earn their way back into your life. That's not cruelty. That's just what respect looks like when it's real. My son is 4 now. He talks about his grandfather with the easy confidence of a child who has never had to question whether he is loved. He doesn't know what happened on Easter Sunday. Someday, when he's older, I'll tell him the truth, not to make him angry, but because he deserves to understand where things started, and how hard some people had to work to become who he now knows them to be. That's the part of the story worth keeping. Not the damage, the repair. And the little drawing in the maple frame, still hanging in the front hallway, right beside the photo of his dad.